B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, June 11th, 2018. You may have noticed that your humble host is not the biggest sports fan. I rarely talk about professional competition. But when your home team sweeps the NBA playoffs 3 out of 4 years in a row, and you can stick it to Cleveburg, it's a little hard to resist. I am proud of the Golden State Warriors. They're an incredible team. And while I don't pay attention most of the season, when they get into the playoffs, I find it fascinating and quite rewarding. So congratulations to the team. Let's hope we have a fatality-free celebration parade in Oakland tomorrow. Well, on Friday, I told you that the Democratic National Committee had a meeting in Rhode Island. And the expectation was they were going to do something to at least fix the perception that the superdelegates squelched any chance of a grassroots upstart candidacy, the Bernie candidacy, in 2016. And instead of addressing the superdelegate issue, they passed a new rule, which I am calling the Bernie ban. And it basically stipulates that anybody seeking the nomination of the Democratic Party to run for president must be a member of the Democratic Party. They must assert that they will accept the Democratic nomination, and they must run and serve as a member of the Democratic Party. Can you think of anybody else besides Senator Sanders to whom this would be applied? I can't. And this exercise in party purity is flatly suicidal. And some of my Facebook friends who still aren't over Hillary, they always complain that Bernie wasn't a Democrat, isn't a Democrat, and he shouldn't be part of the Democratic Party in any way, shape, or form. And that kind of thinking is truly a death sentence, self-imposed. Because people want purity, but the mainline corporate Democrats like Hillary Clinton don't have the capacity to expand the appeal of the party to critical independent voters. And while party purity might make sense at the local and state level, it doesn't make any sense in the race for the White House. And so I cannot believe that the party would adopt this at this time. To put it mildly, it's a poke in the eye to the millions of people across the country who supported and voted for Bernie Sanders in 2016. And instead of finding a way to seduce them into greater participation in the Democratic Party, and pardon my language here, the message is clear. If you supported Sanders, go fuck yourselves. Because we only want pure Democrats. You know, the kind who have sold out to corporate interests, who support AIPAC blindly. And Sanders isn't perfect. I share my criticisms of him on a regular basis. While he has spoken up in defense of the Gaza protesters and offered mild criticism of Israel's potshots that have killed over 100 of those Palestinians in recent months, Bernie Sanders has a long way to go on foreign policy. And I'm not heavily invested in Sanders as the sole standard bearer for progressives in the 2020 primary and campaign. Let the best woman or man prevail. Let the voters decide. And if Elizabeth Warren can show that she has grown, that she is more than a one-issue candidate, I am open to supporting her in 2020. I'm not there yet, and I'm not endorsing her. I'm only offering that as an example, that to shut out the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the activist base that extends to independents like me is simply self-defeating. And to do this in advance of the remaining primaries and the midterm elections this November, where there are some progressives who've managed to clear the primaries, sends a really ugly message. And I hope there's outrage. I hope that there is big dispute and protest inside the ranks of the Democratic Party over this idiotic move. And if the Democrats insist on it, they are consigning themselves to that proverbial ash heap of political history. And consider the source of both this report I'm about to give you and the lawsuit that is in action. This came from Murdoch's New York Post, and the aggressive party here is the Committee to Defend the President, a pro-President Trump PAC. And they have filed a lawsuit against the Democratic National Committee, alleging that there was money laundering, illegal transfers, and campaign finance law violations related to a whopping $84 million in contributions to the Hillary Victory Fund. Now, if you're a regular listener, you know I've brought this up more than once. I believe there was illegal transfer of money, and the best-known event was when George and Amal Clooney were invited to a fundraiser where they contributed $350,000. And the way it worked was the money was supposed to be peeled off with the maximum, I think, $2,700 contribution to the Hillary for President campaign, and the rest was supposed to go to support state-level candidates by distributing the funds to state political party entities, Democratic, like the state party of California. But we know that the same treasurer who was managing the Hillary Victory Fund was also running the DNC finances and worked directly for the Clinton campaign. And we saw the records of transactions where after one of these big fundraisers, large amounts of money were transferred to the state funds. Then immediately that money was transferred to Washington, and it was supposed to be held for use in the general election in the fall to support the eventual nominee of the Democratic Convention. But we know that some of that money was spent on digital ads in the primaries in support of a single candidate, and it wasn't Bernie. The party has failed to investigate this. You may have heard me ask Norman Solomon and others who are part of the autopsy of the Democratic Party about this, the autopsy of the loss in 2016. And while this report comes from the New York Post and the active party here is pro-Trump, that doesn't invalidate the claim. And it deserves to be fully aired out, and if violations occurred, penalties and accountability should be imposed. Over at Who, What, Why today, Klaus Mara has an interesting piece called Dems Are Once Again Poised to Fumble Away a Must-Win Election. And he talks about he's one of those people who covers politics, but even still, he couldn't tell you what the Democrats' platform or their plan for winning is this November. And he writes, instead of coming up with policies that'll change the lives of Americans in a meaningful way, they keep getting sucked into the Trump trap. And I have one Facebook friend who is hoping that the P-tape is real and that the golden showers will be shared with the American viewers at some point. But I would argue at this stage we've seen that despite the Stormy Daniels scandal, Trump has not lost any support from his base. It appears to be growing slightly. And so the idea that Democrats can keep running and just say we're better than the Republicans, we're not Trump. Well, Mara writes, Democrats are sure that this time the public will surely realize that he is a know-nothing liar and demagogue who is destroying the U.S. from within. But he continues, it won't happen. Anybody who hasn't cared this far won't start now, and the people who do care are already enraged. The ones in the middle are probably just numb from the avalanche of scandals and lies. Being against Trump clearly is not enough. They need to explain to Americans what will make their lives better. I've linked to Mara's piece with a cartoon by Don Quixote, and you can find it at whowhatwhy.org. Another quote here. Politics is no longer about explaining complex issues to voters. It's about buzzwords and winning the message war. And with Trump monopolizing the so-called earned media, the free coverage, Democrats have a steep mountain to climb to make the case that the economy isn't doing as well as the president would have voters believe. With 5 months to go, there's no sign Democrats are working on anything like he recommends, like Jeff Merkley going to that detention center for child immigrants and trying to get in. He said, that's the kind of effective campaigning that Democrats should be doing, but it's not happening. And our friend, listener, and generous supporter, John Zweibel in Hawaii, he's a very frustrated progressive Democrat. He was listening online to KQED, the public radio station here in San Francisco this morning, and my old colleague, Michael Krasny, was interviewing James Clapper, the proven perjurer. And by the way, I failed to mention that the public television news hour, the same night that they interviewed Clint Watts last week, they had James Clapper on, and they just let him turn on the lies and keep going. So Zweibel writes, disappointingly, this program gave a platform to Clapper to hype the Russian propaganda. Clapper claimed that Russia was able to touch 126 million Americans and supposedly influence them to vote for Trump. Russia's Internet Research Agency did not spend even $1 million. When stacked up against the amounts paid by the Clinton campaign alone, $623 million, claiming that the troll farm in St. Petersburg swayed Americans is ludicrous. I fully agree with you, Mr. Zweibel. Clapper denied the existence of the deep state. Depending on who's using the term, Clapper himself could be considered one of the main operatives. Clapper's goal appears to be continued development of fractures within the Democratic Party, promotion of the oligarchs at the expense of the rest of us, and I will add this all comes under the claim that Vladimir Putin is trying to sow dissent and sow division among Americans without any acknowledgement of how good we are at doing it to ourselves. Also, I want to acknowledge that we have a listener in Lisbon, Portugal. And Mateus dropped me an email last week when he heard me make a comment about how the PBS NewsHour never has on whistleblowers, critics, progressives of almost any note. And while I was riffing about John Kiriakou, I mentioned in passing that the last time I talked to him, he was basically accepting the intelligence community's assertions about Russiagate. And Mateus said, wait, Peter, that's not the case anymore. And Mateus listens to my podcast and to Loud and Clear, which is the show co-hosted by Brian Becker and John Kiriakou on the Sputnik channel. And so I fired off an email to check with Kiriakou, and he said, hi, Peter. Yes, indeed. I've been outspoken against the Russia did it narrative. Brian Becker and I talk about it all the time on our radio show, Loud and Clear, and I've given numerous interviews about it on RT and one recently on the CCB. Glad to clear that up. Glad to have John Kiriakou in the skeptics' camp. Now, there's one more big impediment for Democratic success, either in the midterms or in 2020. Today, the Supreme Court supported voter caging in the case brought from Ohio, where John Husted, the current Republican Secretary of State, purged the voter rolls by using Karl Rove's favorite tactic. You look for somebody who hasn't voted recently, and you send them a postcard, and you tell them that if they don't respond to that postcard, they will be dropped from the voter rolls. It's called caging. And the vast majority of people do not respond, even when it's in their self-interest. And writing for the minority in the court, Justice Breyer said that the majority had placed too much reliance on failures to respond to the notices. He said in 2012, Ohio sent out 1.5 million notices to about 20% of the state's registered voters. But only 4% of Americans move outside the county where they reside each year. So, Ohio received back only about 4%, 60,000, which said, in effect, you're right, Ohio, I have in fact moved. Breyer continued. In addition, Ohio received back about 235,000 return cards which said, in effect, you're wrong, I have not moved. But here's the bottom line. In the end, there were more than 1 million notices, the vast majority of notices sent, to which Ohio received back no return card at all. And then, when you look at the actual targets of these voter caging schemes, A Reuters study in 2016 found that at least 144,000 people were removed from the voting rolls in the three largest counties, Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Columbus, which is where most of the Democrats are registered. This targeting is not accidental, in my humble opinion. And despite the fact that the uber-conservative Sixth Circuit Appeals Court in Cincinnati ruled in favor of the plaintiff, saying that Ohio had violated the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 by using the failure to vote as a trigger for sending these voter caging notices. This is a real setback, and I don't consider the U.S. a democracy. It's a republic. But the participation, the involvement of voters in our republic, the small d democracy that many people think is a given, has been deeply undermined by this. And only Justice Sotomayor took the opportunity for her own dissent to say that Ohio's program was a piece with concerted state efforts to prevent minorities from voting and to undermine the efficacy of their votes, and that they were an unfortunate feature of our country's history. I wish she had used the term Republican organized and orchestrated voter suppression, because that's what this is, and the Supreme Court today ruled 5-4 that it's okay. Are the Democrats speaking up? We haven't seen Democrats fight about election stuff really since 2000. They whiffed on the theft in Ohio of the Kerry presidency in 2004. And because Obama could roll up victory margins that were greater than the margin of graft, Democrats just said, oh, we don't have any problems with our election system, and if we do, we're not going to meddle with it because, after all, it got all of us elected. And to them, this system ain't broke. So why fix it? That's the mentality that is prevalent in the upper ranks of the Democratic Party today. And they just continue to lose, and lose. But hey, they're raising all that corporate money for the midterm elections. They're imposing, self-funding, spy veterans, military veterans as candidates to be recruited. And most Democrats are oblivious to just about all of this. Now to the stinky scene that Trump created, crapping all over the G7 summit. He came late, he left early. He angered everybody there, he pointed fingers, he raised his voice. But in the end, he agreed to the communique that is traditional at the end of these meetings. But he got on Air Force One on the long flight to Singapore and hit his Twitter machine. And he started attacking Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, saying that he's weak, that he's a liar, that he had been such a nice guy in the meetings and then he held this news conference. Trump tweeted based on Justin, he used the first name, on Justin's false statements at his news conference and the fact that Canada is charging massive tariffs to our U.S. farmers, workers, and companies. I have instructed our U.S. reps not to endorse the communique as we look at tariffs on automobiles flooding the U.S. market. And then his allies, Larry Kudlow, and this guy Peter Navarro, the far-right economist, they piled on saying that Justin Trudeau stabbed Donald Trump in the back. And this is such pure bullshit. There is no way to justify this. Trudeau was diplomatic. He was polite, but he was firm, and he didn't say anything that he hadn't said to Trump or to the public before. In particular, Canada and other countries that consider themselves our allies are steamed that we claim that it is national security risks that cause us to raise these tariffs. Everybody knows that is a lie. But Canadians are closing ranks in support of Trudeau. Even Doug Ford, you remember Rob Ford, the guy who was doing crack while he was mayor of Toronto? Well, his brother Doug Ford is now the Premier of Ontario, which is the province where Toronto is located. And he said, "We will stand shoulder to shoulder with the Prime Minister and the people of Canada." Stephen Harper, the Conservative who was defeated by Trudeau, said, "I can understand why the American people feel they need some better trade relationships, but this is the wrong target." So there's an interesting commentary on this, and I rarely find anything very compelling or persuasive in the opinion pages of the Washington Post. But Callum Borchers writes today that Trump appears to be lashing out at Justin Trudeau and bullying him to impress little Kim Jong-un, little Rocket Man. And the evidence is in this op-ed. It's pretty persuasive. He cites Larry Kudlow being interviewed by Jake Tapper yesterday. So, Tapper says, was this about North Korea? Kudlow: of course, it was. In large part, absolutely. And he goes on to say, we get on the plane, this guy Trudeau starts blasting us. So what is the key here? Kudlow: Kim must not see American weakness. So this is all about the insecurity of Donald Trump. The only way he can feel big is to punch downward at someone he sees as smaller, weaker, and vulnerable. It's really plain old pathetic. So the summit actually begins in the next 12 hours or so. Because Singapore is across the international date line, Tuesday is Monday, today is Monday, and late tonight West Coast time is when, actually 6 p.m. West Coast time, is when the actual first meeting will take place. The U.S. is using carrots and sticks right down to the last minute. Newly minted Secretary of State and former spy Mike Pompeo is offering unprecedented security guarantees to Kim Jong-un if he will denuclearize. We're not told what those security assurances are. But one little footnote that I picked up in the coverage today is Kim Jong-un plans to fly back to North Korea in the early afternoon on Tuesday. Now that leaves, 4, maybe 6 hours for meetings with Trump after all this buildup, after they traveled all over the place to do this? That's a Trump move. Throw your opponent off his or her balance. Will Kim out-Trump Trump? Inquiring minds await the answer to that question. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. I want to thank Paul Lacombe, Peter Hoffmeister, Jason Ferguson, and Margaret Anderson. They're all monthly boosters of the PBC podcast. I invite you to join them. Visit peterbcollins.com on any device. You'll find the menu tab, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber. You land on the sign-up page, and you can make a choice among the options there that fits your budget. I need some new subscribers, so I hope you'll come through for me. The Trump administration is going all out to kill Obamacare, and they are using the courts now to try to kill the pre-existing conditions protection that patients have. And the politics of this are screwy, but there is a subset in the United States who responds to messaging from right-wing Republicans. And essentially the message is, wouldn't you rather die than accept government-controlled socialist health care? Now, I don't think the average American cares. If they can get health insurance coverage that they can afford and that will provide what they need when they get sick, most people really don't care what the framework of that is. But the Trump crowd believes all of their own bullshit, and this is just another example. Front page of Sunday's New York Times, a think piece. In the Trump administration, science is unwelcome, so is advice. They mention that Trump is going to Singapore without a scientist who knows nuclear weapons to offer his advice and analysis. and that whether it is at the EPA or anywhere else in the Trump administration, that science is on the outs, science is unwelcome. And that's a very persuasive kind of bias confirmation argument. And I want to challenge you to listen to my latest in-depth interview released today to subscribers as Jonathan Latham, who is the co-founder and executive director of the Bioscience Resource Project. He edits the Independent Science News website, and he has just helped release the Poison Papers, a huge trove of documents going back almost 100 years, showing how attempts to regulate the chemical industry basically led to the chemical industry deciding what regulations it would accept. And he offers a blistering indictment of today's EPA, and yesterday's too. He says whether it's Trump or Obama, the EPA doesn't do its job, and it tends to take care of the industries it is supposed to regulate. Here's Jonathan Latham describing what he calls this insidious game.
And so you've got this complicated game going on, which at the same time as all this is happening, you have companies like Monsanto and Exxon and Chevron, all these companies are getting a free ride. They cannot tell the public that they're getting a free ride, that EPA always gives us the answer we want, that we have people inside the agency who make sure that even if something, bad decision came through, it will be squashed. They can't tell that. They have to spend all their lives fulminating about how the EPA's overreach. Right? They must do that in order to maintain the illusion that EPA is actually doing its job. Right? So you've got this complicated process going on where EPA is not doing its job, but the companies are complaining about EPA as if EPA is doing its job. And then you've got Donald Trump who comes into the room and doesn't realize that this is a totally faux fight. There's no real battle between EPA and Monsanto. EPA is just in Monsanto's pocket. But because he's listened to all this propaganda, and maybe Scott Pruitt has listened to all this propaganda too, he then goes in and says, I'll sort this out, I'll appoint Scott Pruitt, I'll make sure that they never get to do anything. But essentially, he doesn't understand that there's a much more subtle and complicated game going on.
That's Dr. Jonathan Latham. I hope you'll listen to the full interview available for subscribers today at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, and Spreaker. I'm really shocked at the editorial that I have printed out in my hands right here. It's from the Los Angeles Times. Now, I don't know if the new owner has taken over the Times yet. It had been owned by the Chicago Tribune, and the holding company is called Trunk. So I'll try to track that down, but in the meantime, I'm thrilled with this editorial because it very bluntly states that we don't need the so-called Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2018. This misguided legislation, the editorial says, purports to target harassment of Jewish students on college campuses, but this proposal would blur the distinction between unacceptable, intimidating expressions of intolerance directed against Jews with criticism of the State of Israel. The latter, even when expressed in intemperate terms, is protected by the First Amendment. They continue. Civil rights law already protects Jews, Muslims, Christians, and other religious groups at federally funded campuses from discrimination. What would change under this legislation is that in investigating complaints of anti-Semitism, the Department of Education would have to take into consideration a definition published by the State Department in 2010. But that lengthy document, the editorial continues, which was never intended to serve as a speech code for American college campuses, conflates anti-Israel speech with anti-Semitic speech. For example, it offers examples of ways in which anti-Semitism manifests itself with regard to the State of Israel, taking into account the overall context. That includes blaming Israel for all interreligious or political tensions and applying double standards by requiring of Israel a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. It also includes demonizing Israel. But the writers of the editorial say, is it necessarily anti-Semitic to harshly criticize the Jewish state, or to do so without in the same breath criticizing Saudi repression? Is it anti-Semitic to argue that Israel should be replaced by something else like a secular binational nation? Even those who believe such criticisms of Israel are simplistic or unfair should see that they are far removed from the sort of insults or personal attacks that a university or the federal government can police without running afoul of the First Amendment. Even strong supporters of the State of Israel should acknowledge that while there are, of course, anti-Semites among Israel's many critics, not all opposition to Israel is inherently anti-Semitic. And the editorial concludes, the proposed legislation should be shelved. And speaking of censorship, just up the road from me in the next county, Petaluma, had their high school graduation on June 2nd. The valedictorian, 17-year-old Lulabelle Seitz, had a 4.0 GPA. She's on her way to Stanford, but they cut the mic midway through her graduation speech, because about 4 minutes into the speech, she began to talk about sexual assault allegations at the school, and officials cut the microphone. So here's a quote. This is what she was trying to say. The class of 2018 has demonstrated time and time again that we may be a new generation. We are not too young to speak up, to dream, and to create change. Which is why, even when some people on this campus, those same people, and that's where she got cut off, in which some people defend perpetrators of sexual assault and silence their victims. Now, Ms. Seitz told a local newspaper that she was sexually assaulted by another student, and when she reported it to high school officials, they took no action. And the school officials admitted they cut her mic, but said we can't comment due to privacy issues. This is insidious and unacceptable. A judge in New York has at least temporarily blocked the deportation of the pizza delivery guy who delivered a pizza to the garrison at Fort Hamilton. He is Pablo Villavicencio, 35-year-old married father of two, and the judge has at least put on hold attempts to deport him. My former producer and able newspaper reporter for the San Diego Union Tribune, Joshua Emerson Smith, was assigned to go to the border at Otay Mesa and report on a protest by immigrants and their supporters. About 200 people were there, and the protest was about the way asylum seekers who came as part of the caravan that scared the shit out of Trump, well, they're being held in a prison. And the conditions suck. They are forced to work. They're being paid something like 10 cents an hour. A little bit more than that, maybe 13 cents an hour. When we ask for medical attention, they do not treat us. Many of us have pains and wounds. And a woman who was held at the same facility but released a few months ago said for any medical needs, it's non-existent. They barely offer you water. I've linked to Joshua's article. Encourage you to follow his work. The guy who started Craigslist, Craig Newmark, a San Francisco guy who I've met a few times, he has given a $20 million contribution to the City University of New York's Graduate School of Journalism. Now, that money was basically made at the expense of newspapers that used to subsidize the expense of news gathering with the classified ads for jobs and other services that are now all free on Craigslist. And he is supporting Jeff Jarvis, who is a professor and a director of a journalism center there at CUNY. I knew Jeff Jarvis in the 70s in Chicago before he went on kind of a tabloid gossip news bender. I hope he's recovered from that. And finally today, good news for my Bay Area listeners. Liberal Talk is going to be back on AM radio. This is a shocking move, and it is counter to most of the trends. But iHeartMedia has announced that their AM station on 910 KKSF, which has been delivering Spanish-language sports programming, is going to switch to liberal talk, progressive talk, starting tomorrow, June 12th. Stephanie Miller in the morning, Tom Hartman, 9 to noon, Norman Goldman, our buddy from L.A., he will have the afternoon slot. The rest of the lineup, I think, is still being determined. But it's a refreshing change in the trend line to see a radio station adopting progressive talk. Thanks for listening to this daily news and comment podcast. It's free, and you're free to share it far and wide. You'll find it on YouTube, too. I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.